Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the diplomatic vessel and watched the council chamber through the transparent wall. The room was enormous, filled with representatives from dozens of alien species, all wearing clothes that shimmered with colors he had never seen on Earth. The Galactic Council had been meeting for 3 days straight, and the humans were still the outsiders. He stood in his military uniform, a young lieutenant from a species that the galaxy had only discovered 50 years ago. The Void Collective was spreading across the edge of the galaxy, consuming entire worlds and leaving nothing behind. Every species sent their best strategists and their strongest voices to discuss the threat. The Valorian Empress sat at the head of the chamber, and Jake could not stop looking at her. She was tall and ancient, with skin that seemed to glow with inner light, and eyes that had seen thousands of years pass. Her people were the oldest civilization in known space, and they had always been leaders. The human delegation was small, only 5 people, including Jake. The other species did not see humans as important players in the galactic government. They saw them as newcomers, a lucky species that had developed space travel faster than expected, but still primitive in many ways. The council members spoke in careful diplomatic language, but Jake understood what they really meant. They did not trust humanity to help with something this serious. They did not believe that humans could contribute anything valuable to the defense against the Void Collective. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his face calm. His commander had warned him before the mission that the galaxy would not see humans as equals. They had to prove themselves through actions, not words. The Empress finished speaking to the Valorian ambassador and looked across the chamber. Her gaze swept past the other delegates and stopped on Jake for a moment. Their eyes met. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, and then turned to speak with another leader. Jake felt something shift inside him. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it mattered. The Empress of the greatest civilization in the galaxy had noticed him, not as a representative of humanity, but as an individual. That evening, after the formal sessions ended, Jake walked through the observation deck. He needed time alone to think about the weight of representing his entire species. The delegation had done well in the meetings, presenting Earth's resources and military capabilities, but he could see the doubt in every delegate's eyes when they listened to the responses. A soft voice spoke from behind him. "You carry a heavy burden for someone so young." Jake turned and found the Empress standing alone, without her usual guards. His heart jumped into his throat. "Your Majesty, I did not expect to find me walking without ceremony." "I understand," the Empress said, moving to stand beside him at the window. "When you have lived as long as I have, you learn to value the simple moments of peace." Jake did not know what to say. The Empress looked out at the stars, and her ancient eyes reflected the light of distant suns. "Your species is new to the galaxy," she said, "but I see something in you that many others miss." "What is that?" Jake asked. "Respect," the Empress said, turning to look at him. "Most beings in this chamber look at me with fear or desire to impress me. You look at me with respect. You believe that I have wisdom worth hearing." Jake nodded slowly. "I believe that, Your Majesty. When this war comes," the Empress said, "and it will come, humanity will need to show the galaxy what it truly is." "We are ready," Jake said. "We may be new, but we are strong." The Empress smiled, a smile that held thousands of years of understanding. "Strength is not measured by weapons or technology alone," she said. "I have seen countless powerful species fall because they believed their power made them superior to compassion." She placed a hand on his shoulder, and Jake felt the warmth of it through his uniform. "When the moment comes that decides everything," the Empress continued, "you will know what to do." "How can you know that?" Jake asked. "Because I have learned to see the future in the choices people make today," the Empress replied. And I see someone in you who will choose correctly. The next morning, the council announced the end of the summit. Each species would return to their territory and prepare their defenses against the void collective. Humanity would send its best warriors to patrol the outer regions. Jake received orders to report to a battleship that would leave within 2 days. As he packed his belongings in the small cabin, he thought about the Empress's words. He did not know what she meant about a moment that decided everything. He only knew that when it came, he would not run. He would stand firm and do what was right. That was the human way. Or at least it should be. Jake looked out his cabin window at the stars beyond. Somewhere in that vast darkness, something was hunting, and humanity would have to prove that it belonged among the stars, not through power, but through courage. The alarm sounded across the ship at 0300 hours, and Jake woke instantly. Years of military training had taught him to move from sleep to readiness in seconds. He pulled on his uniform and ran toward the bridge, already knowing that this was not a drill. The distress signal was coming from a scientific outpost 2 sectors away. The message was broken and incomplete, but the meaning was clear. Something had attacked the colony, and survivors were asking for help. Captain Diana Hayes stood before the tactical display, watching reports pour in from all 3 vessels in their patrol group. The colony had been destroyed almost completely. The few remaining life signs were fading fast, and there was something worse. The Void Collective was still there, still feeding, still destroying. Jake took his position at the communication station and began recording the coordinates and survival information. The other 2 ships were already moving toward the colony. They had only minutes before they would arrive in combat range. Captain Hayes gave the order to jump to faster than light travel, and the ship shuddered as it accelerated. The bridge fell silent except for the sound of computers working. No one spoke about what they all knew. This would be humanity's first real combat against the Void Collective, and they had no idea if they were ready. The jump took only 15 minutes, and then suddenly the stars were normal again. What they saw made Jake's breath catch in his throat. The colony was gone, not destroyed, but consumed everything that had been there. All the buildings and equipment and stores was simply vanished. In its place were massive shapes moving through space, shapes that seemed to shift and pulse with hunger. The Void Collective looked nothing like the intelligence reports had suggested. They were not single creatures, but swarms, thousands of smaller entities moving together. A cloud of living darkness that consumed everything it touched. The other 2 ships were already attacking, their weapons firing at the swarm, but the weapons passed through the creatures with little effect. The beings scattered and reformed. Always moving, always hungry. Open fire, Captain Hayes commanded. All weapons. The ship shuddered as its weapons activated. Beams of energy shot toward the swarm, and some of the creatures scattered, but most of them did not seem to notice the attack at all. They continued moving through the remains of the colony, feeding on the wreckage. Jake watched the tactical display and saw the signatures of the other 2 council ships joining the battle. There was a ship that was different from the others, smaller but more heavily defended. Jake's eyes went wide when he saw the designation. It was the Empress's transport. She had not attended the final day of the council meeting. The official story was that ceremonial duties had delayed her, but she was here now, and the Void Collective was between her ship and the safety of deeper space. The communication channel crackled with urgent voices. The Empress's ship had taken damage from a solar flare near the outpost. Its power systems were failing. The escape pods could not be launched because the main systems were offline. The ship was losing power rapidly, and the Void Collective was moving toward it. The Empress's guards were trying to hold the creatures back with the ship's weapons, but the systems were failing faster. Captain Hayes made the decision quickly. All ships Focus on creating a corridor for the Empress's transport to escape. The three battleships repositioned themselves, trying to draw the Void Collective away from the injured vessel. It was not working. The creatures were too numerous, and they were too hungry. The Empress's transport sent out a distress beacon, but everyone knew what that meant. The ship was losing the battle, and there was nothing they could do to help Jake. Listen to the communications from the Empress's crew. They were sealing themselves in the engine room, trying to survive long enough for rescue. But rescue would not come in time. The Void Collective surrounded the ship, and the light of its weapons began to fade. Captain Hayes gave the order to retreat. The three warships pulled back, fighting to put distance between themselves and the swarm. They could save no one on the Empress's transport. The rules of war said that sometimes you could not save everyone. The rules of war said that saving yourself was more important than dying with others. Jake understood the logic. He also understood that the logic was wrong. The bridge fell silent as they watched the Empress's ship go dark. There was no explosion, because the Void Collective did not use explosions. They simply consumed what was there until there was nothing left. After 15 minutes of silence, the order came to continue the retreat. The other two council ships were already moving away, establishing safe distance from the swarm. The battle had lasted only 30 minutes, and in those 30 minutes, the Empress of the oldest and most powerful civilization in the galaxy had been consumed by creatures from beyond the stars. Jake stood at his station and felt something inside him. Cracky had been trained to follow orders. He had been trained to respect. Commandy had been trained to understand that individual lives sometimes had to be sacrificed for the greater survival, but he had also been trained to protect those who could not protect themselves, and the Empress was not just any person. She was the leader of the civilization that had stood at the head of galactic society for 6,000 years. She had spoken to him about the future. She had seen something in him that others did not see, and now she was gone. Captain Hayes appeared at his station and put a hand on his shoulder. "I know," she said quietly. "I know what you want to do, and I cannot order you to do it." Jake turned and looked at his commander in her eyes. He saw permission, not an order, but permission. He understood what that meant. If he did what he was thinking about doing, he would be court-martialed, would be marked as a soldier who disobeyed direct orders. He would lose everything he had worked for. But the Empress had said something to him that night on the observation deck. "When the moment comes that decides everything, you will know what to do." This was the moment. Jake stood and walked toward the fighter Bane. No one stopped him. Other crew members simply moved out of his way in the bay. He found a single pilot fighter still connected to the launch system. He climbed into the cockpit and began the startup sequence. The ship came alive beneath his hands, and he heard the voice of the flight control officer. "Lieutenant, you are not cleared for launch." "I know," Jake replied, and opened the bay doors. "All weapon systems are locked," the flight controller said. "You will have no weapons." "I do not need weapons," Jake said, and launched into the darkness of space behind him. The battleship continued its retreat ahead of him. The Void Collective continued to consume the dead world, and between them, a single human fighter moved toward certain death. Jake's fighter cut through the darkness of space, moving faster than anything its designers had intended. His hands gripped the controls as the Void Collective grew larger in his viewport. Creatures were massive when you saw them up close, far larger than they appeared on tactical displays. Each entity was as big as a small building, and there were thousands of them moving in the space where the Empress's ship lay dying. Jake had no weapons that could hurt creatures like that. His fighter carried standard combat systems designed for fighting other starships, not for fighting creatures that consumed matter itself. But he had something better than weapons. He had a human mind that knew how to improvise. The Radio crackled with a warning from Captain Hayes' lieutenant. You are approaching the combat zone with no weapons and no backup. Turn around while you still can. Jake did not respond. He was already analyzing the behavior of the Void Collective. He watched how they moved, how they reacted to the weapons fire from the warships, how they shifted their formation when something changed in their environment. They were not intelligent in the way that humans understood intelligence. They were a swarm, responding to simple drives. They wanted to consume, they wanted to find. Energy, they wanted to multiply. Jake realized something that the Council scientists had missed. The Void Collective was drawn to energy. Signatures the warships had been firing at them with energy weapons, which had made the creatures more aggressive. But the creatures were not trying to destroy the weapons. They were trying to reach the ships that produced the energy. Jake turned his fighter toward the asteroid field that surrounded the colony's remains. He disabled the targeting systems and opened the power core. The reactor began overloading, but slowly. Controlled, the power output increased, and the energy signature of his fighter became a beacon. The Void Collective noticed thousands of the creatures change direction and move toward him. Jake did not feel fear. He felt purpose. He activated the tractor beams, which were designed to pull cargo from space. He began pulling debris toward himself. Asteroids and wreckage and broken metal from the destroyed colony. The debris created a zone of chaos around his fighter. The Void Collective encountered the debris and had to navigate around it. Some of the creatures scattered, confused by the unexpected obstacles. Others tried to consume the debris, which slowed them down. Jake kept moving deeper into the swarm, closer to where the Empress's ship lay silent and dark. The heat in his cockpit was rising. The power core was approaching critical levels. His shields were taking damage from the radiation of his own failing reactor, but he kept going. The communication channel was full of voices now. The other council ships had seen what he was doing. The Empress's guards, still alive in the sealed engine room, were reporting their location through a backup system. They could see through the cameras that something was happening. Something was separating the Void Collective. Something was pushing them away from the ship. Jake positioned his fighter directly between the swarm and the Empress's transport. He was closer to the creatures now than any human had ever been, and survived. He could see the details of their forms, the way the matter seemed to ripple across their surfaces like water. They were beautiful in a terrible way, and they were about to consume him. Jake reached for the final lever. The power core would fail in seconds. His shields would collapse. The reactor would explode, but the debris field he had created would collapse too, scattering thousands of pieces of wreckage into the path of the Void Collective. It would confuse them. It would slow them down. It would buy time. Tell the Empress I was honored, Jake said into the radio. Tell humanity that we stand firm. He pulled the lever. The power core went into full overload. Explosion was not violent like a warship's. Death would have been. It was a cascade of radiation and energy that spread outward in a wave. Jake felt it wash over him, felt his consciousness beginning to fade, but he stayed conscious long enough to see the results. The debris field had collapsed as predicted. The creatures were scattered and confused. The path to the Empress's ship was clear. The Valorian guards in the engine room sent out an emergency beacon. The escape pods activated, and 3 small ships launched from the transport. Behind them, the Void Collective began to recover, beginning to reform their swarm. But the humans had enough time now. The other council ships were moving in, using the patterns that Jake had created. They were attacking with new strategy, with understanding. The Void Collective that had seemed invincible was suddenly vulnerable. The creatures began to retreat, not running away, but instead moving back toward space they had already consumed. The Battle was turning on the bridge of the battleship. Captain Hayes watched her tactical display in amazement. Single human fighter, with no weapons and no backup, had changed the outcome of the battle, but Jake Morrison was not watching the results of his action. His consciousness had already faded. His fighter was drifting now, moving in a slow spiral toward the edge of the debris field, and inside the cockpit, the lieutenant who had chosen to stand firm instead of retreat was not breathing. The Empress's escape pods moved toward the safe area the Council ships had created, and as the Valorian Empress looked back at the burning fighter that had saved her life, she felt something she had not felt in thousands of years. She felt the weight of a debt that could never be repaid. She felt the power of sacrifice. She felt the strength of a species that was new to the galaxy, but was teaching the oldest civilizations lessons about courage. The rescue ship moved quickly through the debris field. Its sensors locked onto the human fighter. Captain Hayes had sent the fastest medical vessel they had available. The moment Jake's fighter stopped responding, she was taking a chance. The protocol said that a fighter engulfed in radiation and fire at the power core's collapse was not survivable. The protocol said that resources should not be wasted on a dead pilot. Captain Hayes ignored the protocols. She had seen what Jake Morrison had done. She had watched as her lieutenant had chosen death over obedience, and she would be damned if he would die. Alone in the darkness, the rescue ship reached the fighter and pulled it aboard. The medical team was waiting, and they moved with practiced efficiency. Jake was still alive, but barely. His body had been burned by the radiation his lungs had taken in. Superheated air. His heart had stopped twice during the explosion, but there was still a spark of life inside him. The medical team worked through the night. They used technology that the humans had learned from the Council, equipment that could repair damage that would have been impossible to treat on Earth. They pumped his lungs clear of damaged tissue. They rebuilt the burned skin using regeneration therapy. They used neurostimulation to wake his brain. Cell by cell and slowly, impossibly, Jake Morrison began to return to the land of the living. The battle continued while he floated in the medical chamber. The Council ships had analyzed what Jake had done. They had learned from his improvisation. The weapons officers began using the tractor beams differently, not to pull cargo, but to move the Void Collective, to scatter them, to create zones of chaos where the creatures could not feed. The strategy was not human in its origin, but it was human in its nature. It was improvisation. It was adaptation. It was refusing to accept that something could not be done. Void Collective began to fall back, not because they were defeated, but because the food source was no longer profitable. The creatures that had seemed like an unstoppable force began to retreat into the deep spaces between the vice stars. The battle was won. 3 hours after the start of the retreat, the Council ships sent a combined message. The Empress was safe. The colony survivors were being evacuated. The Void Collective had withdrawn from the sector. Humanity's first real battle in galactic combat had ended in victory, but on the flagship of the Council fleet, the Empress stood in the medical bay and waited. She had not left the hospital since the rescue ships brought in the survivors. She had questioned every doctor about the human pilot's condition. She had demanded the best care, the most advanced medicine, the most skilled physicians in the entire fleet. No expense was spared, no effort was wasted. The Empress of the oldest and most powerful civilization in the galaxy was determined that the human who had saved her life would not die 5 days after the explosion. Jake opened his eyes. The medical chamber released him, and he took his first breath as a living being after the explosion. His body ached. His mind was foggy, but he was alive. The Empress was waiting for him when he could finally walk. She stood in the doorway of the medical facility. Alone, without her guards, she was still wearing the same clothes she had worn when she escaped the transport. There was dust from the explosion on her hair. There was grief in her eyes, but there was also something else. There was a kind of recognition, a kind of understanding that went deeper than words. "You are alive," the Empress said. It was not a question. Jake struggled to stand at attention. "Your Majesty, I am relieved to see you safe." The Empress moved forward and placed her hands on his shoulders. "You did not have to do what you did," she said. "You could have followed orders. You could have lived." "I could have," Jake agreed. "But you told me that I would know what to do when the moment came." "Yes," the Empress said, and her voice carried the weight of ages. "I did say that." She was quiet for a long moment. "In 6,000 years, I have seen many acts of courage," she continued. "I have seen warriors sacrifice themselves in battle. I have seen leaders choose death over surrender. I have seen beings make the hard choices that save their civilizations." The Empress looked into Jake's eyes. "But I have never seen anything like what you did," she said. "You had no advantage. You had no guarantee. You had only the choice to stand firm or to retreat. And you chose to stand firm. It was the only choice," Jake said. The Empress smiled. "That is exactly right," she said. "That is exactly why humanity will reshape the galaxy." The Empress called for the council to meet immediately. The council chambers were gathered, all the representatives present, all the leaders of the major civilizations. The Empress stood before them and spoke about what had happened. She spoke about how the Void Collective had attacked the colony. She spoke about how the council ships had fought, but most of all, she spoke about Jake Morrison. She told them about a young human who had no weapons. She told them about a soldier who had a choice between following orders and doing what was right. She told them about how that single human had changed the outcome of the battle. She told them about sacrifice and courage, and the strength that comes not from power, but from will. The council listened in silence. When she finished speaking, every representative stood and showed the sign of respect from their own civilization one by one. They voted on a new resolution. Humanity would be recognized as a protected species. Humanity would have full standing in the council. Humanity would have voice and vote in all future decisions. The vote was unanimous. The galaxy had learned that day what humans truly were, not conquerors or servants, not outsiders or inferiors. They were a species that chose to stand firm when all others ran, and that choice, that willingness to sacrifice, was the greatest power in the galaxy. 2 months after the battle, Jake stood on the observation deck of a new human vessel. The ship was called the Enterprise, named after the first human exploring ship from Earth. It was the first warship that humanity would command entirely. On its own, the council had approved the construction and provided the designs, but the decisions about how it would be used, where it would go, and what its mission would be, those decisions were made by humans. Jake had been offered command of the ship. He had accepted with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. He was a lieutenant, not a captain, but the Empress had recommended him personally, and when the Empress of the oldest civilization in the galaxy made a recommendation, the council listened. His uniform had changed. There were medals on his chest that he did not entirely understand. There were commendations from species whose names he could not pronounce. There were honors from civilizations that had not existed when his great-grandmother was born, but the weight he felt most heavily was not from any medal. It was from the knowledge of what had happened, from the memory of what he had chosen to do, from the understanding that one human had changed the course of galactic history. The Empress arrived on the Enterprise. For the official handover ceremony, she walked the corridors of the human ship with an honor guard of her own people, but she dismissed them when she found Jake standing on the observation deck. They were alone together, looking out at the stars. "How do you feel about your new command?" the Empress asked, overwhelmed. Jake said honestly, "Honored, but overwhelmed." "That is the correct response," the Empress said. "A commander who did not feel the weight of responsibility would not be worth trusting." She stood beside him, and they looked out at the darkness together. "The Council is already discussing plans for expansion," she continued. "Humanity will need more ships, more stations, more presence in the galaxy, and you will lead that expansion," she said. Turning to look at him, "I cannot do this alone," Jake said. "I am just a soldier, just a lieutenant who made one choice." "That is where you are wrong," the Empress said. "You are not just a soldier. You are a symbol of what?" Jake asked. "Of what humans can become," the Empress replied. "Of what happens when a species chooses compassion and courage over fear." She placed her hand on his shoulder, just as she had done the night they first spoke. "When I was young, 6,000 years ago, I watched my people rise to dominance through strength and technology," she said. "We conquered worlds, we built great cities, we created wonders that could move the soul. But we forgot something," she continued. "We forgot that true power comes not from what you can destroy, but from what you choose to protect." The Empress looked directly at Jake. "Your species is new to the galaxy," she said. "You do not have the oldest ships or the most advanced weapons. You do not have the deepest understanding of the sciences. But you have something more valuable. What is that?" Jake asked. "You have not yet learned to believe that power is the only thing that matters," she said. "You still believe in things like honor and sacrifice and protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Jake thought about his decision on the bridge of the battle ship. He thought about launching a fighter with no weapons into a cloud of creatures that consumed everything. He thought about the choice to stand between the Empress and death. "I did not know what I was doing," he said. "I just knew that I could not let you die." "Yes," the Empress said, and her ancient eyes held a kind of sadness. "That is the difference. I had become so powerful that I had forgotten to imagine that someone would stand between me and death. I forgot that there was such a thing as a choice between myself and others." She withdrew her hand and turned back to the stars. "You taught me something that day," she continued. "You taught me that the newest species in the galaxy understands better than the oldest what it means to be civilized." Over the next months, the relationship between humanity and the Council deepened. Empress brought a formal alliance between the Valorian Empire and human governments. Other civilizations began to view humans differently where they had seen newcomers. They now saw partners where they had seen lesser beings. They now saw a species with something valuable to teach. Jake received thousands of requests to speak, to give lectures, to tell the story of what had happened in the battle. He refused most of them. He accepted only the ones where he could speak directly to young people, to the next generation of both humans and aliens who would build the future together. And in every speech, he told them the same thing. "When the moment comes that changes everything," he would say, "you will not have time to think about what is right. You will not have time to consider the consequences. You will only have time to choose. And when that moment comes, choose what you believe is right. Choose to stand firm. Choose to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Choose to be better than you think you need to be." The Empress visited the Enterprise one more time to see Jake before she returned to her own territory. She found him in the captain's ready room, reviewing reports about the ship's readiness. "The crew is excellent," he told her. "The finest soldiers and officers we have. I do not doubt it," she said. "They would follow you into darkness now. You are a legend to them." Jake felt discomfort at that. "I am just a soldier who made one choice," he said. "Yes," the Empress agreed. "And that one choice will echo through the galaxy for generations to come." She prepared to leave, and Jake walked her to the docking bay at the entrance to her transport. She turned back to him. "One more thing," she said. "I have been wondering, what would you have done if I had not survived? If the Empress had fallen?" Jake thought about the question. "I think I still would have done the same thing," he said finally. "Because it was the right choice, not because of who you were, but because someone needed protection and I could provide it." The Empress smiled. A smile of absolute satisfaction. "You understand," she said. "That is why humanity will reshape the galaxy. Not because you are stronger or more advanced, but because you understand that the greatest strength comes from the willingness to protect the weak." She entered her transport and rose. From the docking bay, Jake watched her ship ascend towards space, and he understood that everything in his life had changed, not because he had become famous, not because he had received honors, but because he had learned the truth that the Empress had been trying to teach him all along. True strength was not about power. True strength was about choice. It was about standing firm when everything told you to run. It was about protecting others even when it cost you everything, and it was about understanding that one human, one moment, one choice to do what was right could change the course of history. The Enterprise rose from the station and took its place among the stars, and inside the ship, a young lieutenant from a new species stood on the bridge and looked out at the darkness. He was no longer afraid. He understood his place in the galaxy now, and he knew that humanity's true journey was just beginning.